So what research tells us, what we know about autism treatment is the more the better and the earlier the better. So the younger a child can be when they get a diagnosis, and the more intensive the treatment can be early on in their lives in particular, the better the outcomes are for kids. And actually specifically, behaviorally based treatments, eclectic based treatments don't even have as good of outcomes as ones that are more primarily behaviorally based. So really it's important that parents look for high quality ABA programs early on. In terms of are all treatment programs created equal, the answer is no. I think it's the Association for Behavioral Analysis International has a really great handbook for parents that gives you a whole set of questions that parents can access in terms of interviewing consultants when they're trying to find somebody. Programs are going to vary in terms of philosophy, they're going to vary in terms of intensity of supervision, intensity of data collection, qualifications of the people who are supervising the programs, and all of those things are going to affect outcome.
Okay.
The other thing that we know from the research is the more families are involved in the treatment, the better. The more parents can help out with running programs or generalizing programs, the more siblings can be involved in the program, the more they're essentially getting 24, well not 24 because they're not up for 24 hours, but as many of their waking hours as possible in intervention, the better. So the more, ideally a high quality program would have parental involvement or sibling involvement built into the program, but if not, parents should be asking, how can I be involved? What can I be doing outside of session? And how am I going to work this into my life in terms of behavior management, and what learning outcomes are going to fit best within my family's life as well? Okay, so I think probably one of the most difficult things to treat in autism treatment are the behaviors, either the deficits in social behavior or the behavioral excesses that they have, particularly the self-stimulatory behaviors. Those are the most difficult because they're often the most prevalent, and they're the most difficult because the child enjoys doing them for some reason. That's why they're doing them. And so it's hard to intervene on that because the behavior is the reward. So it's hard to get into that behavior chain in order to change that behavior. Aggressive behaviors can also obviously be very challenging depending on how old the child is and how severe the behaviors are. And those are just challenging because when you change something, those behaviors get worse before they get better, and that's sometimes very difficult for families to manage as well. In terms of barriers to getting autism treatment, probably the first one is getting the diagnosis. Particularly within the public systems in British Columbia, the wait lists are extremely long. They're working on it very hard with younger kids, but with older kids, some kids I've heard of 18 to 24 month waiting lists to get a diagnosis. And of course, if you go privately, then the barrier there is finances. It can cost $2,500 to $3,000 to get a comprehensive autism diagnosis done. So that's also a very big barrier for families in terms of accessing treatment. Once you get the diagnosis, I think the next biggest barrier is sort of the aftermath of what comes after, in a way. While you've suspected there's been something wrong for a long period of time, it's still very difficult to deal with the fact that your child has just been given this very serious diagnosis. And in the midst of this very serious processing all of that, you now need to go out and find a consultant and find a treatment team and get a speech therapist and find all of your team members that are going to come together to treat your child. And so it's hard to juggle all of those pieces and getting all of that together with managing your own emotions and trying to come to grips and come to terms with the diagnosis that your child has just been given.
Awesome.
While there is a big gap, again, what we know, the more the better, the earlier the better. So even if the 15 hours is all you can afford to start out with, it's better to start out with that than wait until a period of time when you can afford to fund the full 25 or 40 hour a week program. So it's essential that kids get started on treatment as early as they possibly can. So as soon as the paperwork is done, hopefully you can be out looking for a team, finding a consultant, hiring people and training people, and get going on whatever that funding is going to cover for you to start out with. Okay. So I think different people have different philosophies on whether or not it's possible to recover from autism. I think if we think about autism as a neurological disability, their brains are always going to be wired differently. That doesn't mean we can't teach them the tools to cope with that different wiring, and that some people can't be very successful in using that to their advantage. However, it does mean that for the most part, this is a lifelong disability. It just means that they're going to learn to function in the world differently, some more successfully than others. And I think a lot of it comes down to unfortunately, the neurological hand your child was dealt. And some kids, we can work really intensively and they make amazing gains in the first 2 or 3 years, and then they don't need a lot of intervention early on. Other kids, we put that same amount of work into and they just neurologically are more challenged. I like to say the wires are more crossed. It takes a lot more to sort out the wiring in the brain, and even though we put in exactly the same amount of work in exactly the same way, their outcomes just aren't as good. Really, it is a lifelong process of intervention, just at varying levels and varying intensities, and so it's a matter of finding what's going to work for you and your family in the long term. In terms of hurdles and barriers to treatment, I think there's a number of them in terms of for families to get over. The first is your home is a workplace now. It's a work site. Your home will be, there'll constantly be people coming and going from your home, which is very difficult sometimes for families to get used to. I think of the process of the diagnosis of autism as sort of a 2-step grieving process. The first one is when you get the initial diagnosis, and then for some families you have to have another resetting of expectations 1 to 2 years into treatment, when kids maybe aren't doing as well as we hoped they would, and now you have to deal with the fact that this child is not going to be one of the best outcome kids who's going to recover and who's going to have a relatively typical life, but who's going to be a kid who really struggles to talk or to make friends or to deal with their behaviors. And for families, sometimes that's a very difficult process to go through, to accept sort of what long term this is going to look like for them and their family and their child. So that, I find, is a tough transition for families to make, from the hope that this kid is going to be a best outcome kid to now he's not, and what does the picture look like for them long term, and how do we work with that to still give them the best possible quality of life that we can give them.